Hello and welcome to another episode on the Go Rhody Podcast Network. Today I'm joined with Christian Arnold. He's the digital reporter for the New York Post. He recently interviewed Keith Urgo of Fordham basketball, who was lost his job, and he was the center of a big recruiting violations scandal, if you will. Tell me, Christian, what actually happened starting from, what is it, like a 3-year investigation?
Yeah.
I can't believe that.
Yeah, I think you and I are both pretty surprised at how long this investigation had gone on. What eventually came out and was in the report was that the basketball program had essentially exceeded its entertainment expenses that are allotted for recruits when they come to visit Fordham. It was basically the allotted number of money you can spend per day on a recruit when they're there on a visit for entertainment expenses. Going to a show, going to a game, something as silly as going to a bowling alley, right? You get $75 per day per person. And so what had happened was Fordham had gone over that number a number of times to the number of a little over $10,000 over a 2-year span, which when you think about it, doesn't necessarily sound like it's a lot of money in 2 years for a college basketball program, especially with, some of the things that are going on now with the NCAA and transfer portals and NIL money and all this other stuff. But they got docked for exceeding that allowed expenditure to the extent of a little over $10,000. And then they had also hired and shot promotional material with about 24 potential recruits in Times Square. They brought a professional photographer. They gave them, Fordham gear, all that. And they did this, and that also broke NCAA rules as well.
I keep going back and forth. First, I thought it was laughable. My first recollection of when it happened, we have a lot of Atlantic 10 fans on this podcast network, viewers, and Rhode Island was playing Fordham, and I think that was the first team to play them without Keith. He was suspended, so we were just, what can that be? This is ridiculous with all the things that are going on in the NCAA right now, and there's no rules, no guardrails. So that's how we felt. Then we hear about it, and they vacate all their games. First of all, I love the vocabulary that the NCAA uses. Vacate sounds like a vacation, sounds like a
right.
And then their favorite word is impermissible instead of saying that it's illegal. Mm-hmm. So, but then you read about that and you feel like, hey, this was bigger than I thought. Maybe they deserved some kind of infractions. But so I go back and forth on it. But overall, with all the things that are going on and in the past violations that were made, do you think it was over the top?
I do think that it definitely has an air of, we want to make sure that, we're still in charge. We're making sure that we're keeping an eye on everybody. It you can argue it has that sense of a little bit of message sending, right? And I think, again, that's sort of the feeling that you got when you talked to Keith. I talked to him for about 20 minutes on the phone doing the story, and he was calm, he was very diplomatic, but you could still sense some of the frustration, right? I think that he was happy to get the black cloud that was over him, off of him finally. But you could sense in another breath that there was some frustration of why this was done the way it was and why the aggressiveness, at least in his words, was there from the NCAA in this investigation. I think there was a point in the conversation, it didn't make the story, but it said on the record, so, I don't mind sharing it, but there was a point where he said to me, it was almost like they couldn't do much to the big dogs, so they wanted to penalize us to try and make it look like they still had control and power. And talking about the NCAA, just to make that clear.
This is great information that you don't get in any of the articles, including yours. You only have so many words to use.
Right. To me, just talking from my own personal opinion here, right, it does seem a little excessive, right? Because understandably, $75, which is your allotted entertainment expenses, seems very low, right?
Yeah.
I have 3 nephews. I can barely take one of them out for lunch, and I live on Long Island. You can barely take one of them out for lunch for under $75. So imagine taking not only a prospect or recruit to trying to take them bowling. Bowling, I think their bowling was on there as one of the expenses that went over for $75. And you're talking it's them, probably their mom and dad, maybe an additional family member. Trying to do that with them for under $75 or just at the limit is crazy, especially in New York City where things are obviously a lot more expensive. So I think that if the NCAA said, "Hey, like we have to do something here. We're going to give you, probation for a couple of years because obviously this isn't anyone taking a prospect out and buying them a multi-million-dollar car or all these lavish gifts that we've seen in the past that come back to haunt programs and the NCAA has had to step in. But we have to do something, right? It's fair that a probation perhaps would have been a better route to go instead of all these seemingly excessive penalties, which do impact the basketball program, right? You're vacating one of Fordham's best seasons in recent history, one that put Keith Urgo on the map and really put Fordham on the map. And I wasn't with the New York Post at the time, but I had the pleasure of covering that A-10 tournament with Fordham in it, and that game against LaSalle, where it was an incredible atmosphere at Barclays Center, where you had, I think it was one of, if not the largest crowds for Fordham basketball ever, and that place was rowdy, and you could sense, like, that felt like when I'm a little bit younger, but when you hear some of my more experienced colleagues talk about, like, old school New York City college basketball, you kind of got that sense that season, right? That was such an incredible year. And now to kind of have to look back and go, well, the wins necessarily aren't there anymore because they're vacated. And it's just an unfortunate turn of events. And, maybe it does speak to sort of what a lot of people have been saying and feeling, I think, around, the internet and Twitter. And you see some of the clips about just people not feeling like this was the NCAA's way of trying to, like, feel like they still have power. And the more you kind of look at it, the more you go, like, I get it. Like, I get where you're coming from when you say that.
It's a bully. You don't pick on someone your own size. You always pick on the little kid, and you get away with it. It sounds like that. And but now that 25-8 season was so impressive, and everyone was thinking about, okay, what's next? Did they finally turn the corner? Which happens when you have a season like that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe behind the scenes, this was going on and it impacted the team recruiting wise. It just came to me a few minutes ago when you were revealing some of the things. Do you think it could have been the reason for their lackluster season?
It was a similar question. It was a similar question that I had too, going into that interview. Was you look at that first year and Keith, like I said earlier, Keith Urgo and Fordham were on the map. They had a lot of attention on them. One thing I will say about New York City and New York sports is everyone loves that underdog. I did ask Keith that. I was curious myself because you look at those next couple of years and you look at how long that investigation ran, you couldn't help but wonder. And so he said that it certainly had an impact. Maybe not necessarily as much that second season he was there, but he did say it weighed on him a bit because he was in a lot of meetings with investigators and these different people, and they come to these programs. And I will say one thing too, when you look at the end of the season press conferences during the A-10, there are a couple guys that absolutely, praised Keith Urgo right to the end, telling reporters about how he kept them engaged throughout the season, even with the record as rough as it was. There were still some really fun moments for this team, and I think even after he was left, there was a lot of shock just because of how beloved he was around the program, among the players, obviously among the alumni and the fans. And
I don't think anyone could predict what the outcome was. It seemed like it was just a tiny infraction that he did, and it was a waste of time. We were all on his side, but no one could predict that. Are you sure there wasn't anyone else on the telephone when like his lawyer? Because if I was Keith, I would say, yeah, it had a tremendous impact on the season, and we would have been not 25-8, 30-3. But
I just think from the coach he is, from what I've heard, that wouldn't be his style. You know what I mean? No. Like, even if that was the case, I don't think that would be his style. So I don't know if he would be willing to find an excuse, but he did admit that it played a factor and it weighed on him.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting to talk about the impermissible activities. You're talking about New York Giants tickets, New York Knicks I wish I was a recruit. Brooklyn Nets, U.S. Open, sporting events. The one that doesn't fit in bowling alleys.
Right.
Wow. How does that come into a major NCAA investigation? So that was a little strange. But that photo shoot too. And it is funny because, and I'm not going to mention names, but I often see players who are visiting the school, and there's always pictures taken. Maybe the difference is it's within the campus rather than at Times Square. But and they're at restaurants often, and they're
Right.
not. I don't know how that works out. I guess you wait till the recruit
I think
takes his
from
wallet out or
my
something
right.
to go to the
I think
bathroom.
from my understanding, at least with the food and stuff
Yeah.
like that, there's a different expenditure allowance for food and things like that, and lodging and stuff like that. So it's separate from the, I guess, the entertainment dollars, entertainment expenses, which is how we end up. You're looking at a bowling expense. Obviously, the bigger ticket items, you could kind of get a sense of like, okay, that's U.S. Open tickets are not cheap. Especially the last couple of years. So
Yeah.
it's easy to see how you go over. It was interesting too when it comes to the Giant suite. There was, I think, some disconnect between what the NCAA alleges happened and how I think the opposite parties kind of see things having happened with the recruit that went to the game. The NCAA basically says that he was in the suite for, I think, a majority of the game or most of the game is kind of what they wrote in their findings, and the pushback was that they went up to visit for a couple minutes, and that's why they didn't report it, because they didn't think it was that much of an infraction, right?
Here's another question for you. How did they find out? When I read about it, it seems like he just had a guilty conscience and called up the NCAA. I have to vet. I did this. I did go to the bowling alley, I admit. But how did it happen? It just, they must have known for him to do that.
Fordham flagged it early on. They self-reported, right? And I think a lot of schools do that. And I think it was tied to, if I'm not mistaken, it was tied to the U.S. Open expenditure, because I'm sure it was a lot of money. I forget. I think it was something around $2,000. So I think that caught some people's eye, and they said we should report this, make sure we're not doing anything wrong. I'm sure that's how the conversation went. They self-reported, and then other things started to become discovered. They found they find the Giants thing. They start going through the books, and they find all these other expenditures that are over. And then it becomes a question of whether Keith Urgo and the basketball program were supposed to know this. What's the culpability of the compliance department, the oversight of the basketball program? The NCAA alleges in their findings that that there was a lack of oversight, which is how these violations happened in the first place. So it's, again, kind of a response to what the findings were, where it seems like the bigger issue at hand was not necessarily what the program was doing, but that there was a lack of understanding of what was allowed when you're recruiting potential players. And
I do see other schools in the past that have come forward without the NCAA finding in hopes that they won't get out of a sanction. So maybe that was the thought. But there's an analogy towards Cleveland State, and the great Jerry Tarkanian said 35 years ago, this is a great quote, the NCAA was so mad at Kentucky, they gave Cleveland State 2 more years of probation.
It's funny, you're the second person to tell me that quote in the last couple of days.
Really?
After publishing. Yeah.
I stole it from the Rhody Basketball Forum. They're the smartest people.
They're on top.
Do you think Ergo will coach anywhere else at some point?
I think so. I think he was very optimistic in terms of what the future lie ahead for him. I think that in terms, again, of the importance in his mind, and I think of the information being out there, people being able to see in black and white, this is what happened. It wasn't some massive recruiting scandal where he was doing the program was doing anything extremely nefarious or anything like that would really be necessarily a black stain on his record. And I think that there is a lot of hope and optimism going forward that he'll be able to work his way back into coaching. I think there is some concern it might be a little easy to get an assistant coaching job first, and then work his way back to a head coaching job. But the way we talked about and the way he kind of said it is that he felt that head coaches would be a little more open to hiring him, and ADs and programs might be a little hesitant, I guess you could say, just because of the sanctions and sort of the show cause and all these different things that have been handed down. But I think that you look at what Keith Urgo did in Fordham for their program, even with the tough 2 years that the Fordham Rams have had the last 2 years, you can still look back and say he helped build a culture and a program that really, that first year was an incredible product to watch. A lot of fun. You really reinvigorated basketball at Fordham, and you could tell that from the fans that showed up every game at Rose Hill, and you could tell that from the fans that were at Barclays Center cheering on during the A-10 tournament, and sort of the excitement going to that next season. Obviously, the next 2 seasons didn't go as well as they hoped, but you listen to the players and you listen to people around the sport that talk about Keith Urgo and talk about what he's able to do. There is a real reverence for him as a coach. And again, I point back to that last press conference at the A-10 tournament where he had guys, just praising him and how he was able to keep everyone engaged, and what could have very easily been a year where guys just check out, especially when things aren't going that way. So I think there'll be a market for Keith Urgo wherever he heads to next, and it'll be interesting to see where that journey takes him.
It always seems to be schools like LaSalle. I could see that they've done that before. My LaSalle fans will be angry with them just deciding, but there definitely will be a home, and I agree with you, starting as an assistant, but he'll be back. Well, once again, thanks for stopping by. I'd love to have you back again. New York Post as a child, was my favorite newspaper. I went to the back of the paper first.
Of course. The best part of the paper, right? And
your headline was great too this time.
Yeah, well, that's I have to give credit to the editors and the desk staff that do that. I am not that creative when it comes to headlines, and those guys are top notch for sure.
Yeah, who is with those headlines? Once again, thanks for stopping by, and we'll be in touch. Hopefully that's the end of this story and we can move on.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.